Hey everyone, and welcome to today's video. Today I have a very interesting video topic for you, and that is I'm going through every single Senate seat and going through the latest poll for that seat and assigning the state based on that poll amount or result. So to give you an idea of how this works, Democrats are at 34, Republicans are at 31, and I'm going to be using the rating system of 15 points or more is safe, 5 to 15 is likely, 1 to 5 is lean, and then 1 and under is tilt. So, for instance, there isn't a poll for the state of Alabama, but all the prediction markets are solid or safe for the Republican. So when there's no poll, I'm going to make it a safe state. But if there was a poll that was like plus 17 for the Republican in Alabama, I would make it go red. Now we can also look at the state of, say, Oregon, where Oregon, the Senate race is up in 2026. General election, there's also not a poll done for this one recently, so solid Democrat. We're going to make Oregon go solid for the Democrats as well. So it's going to work like that. It also, I have been working on something I wanted to show you. This is just a little spreadsheet that I made that shows the average election result for the states since 2018 on the Senate level. So for a state like Georgia, for instance, you'll see how competitive it's been. 1.2, 2.1 in 2020, 2.8 for the Democrat in 2022. So Georgia shows to be very competitive, and we'll see how much the polls align with the average result of the last few years. And I thought it would be an interesting thing just to compare to as we go throughout the video. So for a state like Oregon, for instance, we can look on the chart here and find Oregon, 17.6, safe Democratic in 2020. 2022 is 14.9, just literally 0.1% under 15 points. Averages out to about 16.25. That one's completely in line with what it normally would be. So that's like that. So now we'll go to the next state geographically. We have the state of Idaho. I'm going to do the states that probably aren't having many polls or aren't too competitive first, just to keep the interesting ones and the more competitive ones for the end. For Idaho, looks like there is a polling. There's a hypothetical poll for this one between Jim Risch and Todd Achilles at 48 to 34. So let's see, that's roughly about a 14-point lead with 18% undecided from the Democratic public policy polling. Actually, this one's pretty recent from March 16th to 17th. So that is a 14-point lead, which based on the rating scale, that actually puts Idaho into the likely Republican category based on that. Montana, we'll do Montana while we're over here as well. We'll see what it has here. I'm not going to show the spreadsheet for every single state just because it might take a little bit of time, but Idaho usually is a pretty red state, so we'll kind of do a bunch at once. Montana could be very interesting because this does have competitive elections in the past, and on this one, the rankings are likely Republican. The most recent poll for Steve Daines versus Riley Neal versus Seth Bodnar, when Steve Daines was still in the race, showed Daines winning by a lot of points. Seth Bodnar, Steve Daines was about 14 points. So it's likely Republican on most of the rankings and the final Steve Daines poll. For the sake of this video, just so I'm not putting any spin or opinion on it, I'm going to go with likely Republican, as that's what the last poll, what Daines versus Bednar ended up being. And it'll probably be pretty similar to that on election day. We can pull it up now just to look. Montana won 3.6% for Tester in 2018, so that was a Democratic win. 10 points for the Republican in 2020, and 7.1 for Sheehy defeating Tester in 2024. On average, a 6.9% margin of victory result in Montana, so actually pretty competitive, a likely margin there. So that is in line with the margin on that one. As for Idaho, safe Republican both times, averages out to 30.65%. We'll see how that ultimately goes when this one is listed as likely. We can look at the state of Wyoming. Wyoming, no surprise, is going to be a very safe Republican state. There is, I don't believe, any polling done for this one. Last time I checked, no. So it is solid Republican for all the rankings. So we'll make Wyoming go solid GOP. And again, not really too much of a surprise. Average result of 44.3% for the Republicans on that one. We can look at the state of Colorado. Colorado is one that is a state that used to be competitive, but may not be a poll anymore because it's really not much of a competitive state anymore. So the predictions for this one is just solid Democratic. So not going to be too competitive. Colorado goes in the safe Democratic column. This one for Colorado is overall 11.95%. So it's actually more of a likely Democratic win based on the last few elections of 2020 and 2022, but you can see the trend. 2022, a 14.6% win in the last midterm for the Democrat. Now it's going to be a 2026 midterm where the Republicans are going to be playing defense more than in 2022. We're probably going to see it break 15% just by the election margin on its own. Now, New Mexico is an interesting one because there's no, I believe, Republican candidate on the ballot here. So this is almost guaranteed going to be safe Republican. And there also is not any polls as well. But it is safe Democratic. And I meant to say safe Democratic. If I said safe Republican, I apologize for that. New Mexico is going to be safe Democratic, despite the fact that the Senate elections in New Mexico have been decently competitive depending on the election. It was 23.6% in 2018, the last Democratic midterm. Going to see that likely eclipse that for 2026. But in 2020, only a 6-point win and only a 10-point win, averaging out to about 13.26%. So if the Republicans could have fielded a decently competitive candidate, there's a possibility the state may have been competitive in 2026, though that 2018 number certainly looms large over the prospects for the Republicans in that state. Again, I'm going to skip Alaska because that's the one that's going to be very close and very competitive that I want to come back to. South Dakota, I'm not banking on there being any polls for this one. This one really shouldn't be too competitive once the general election happens. Looks like there might be some polling actually. And there is Mike Rounds versus Julian Boudin from November of 2025. So not super recent, but relatively recently. Is 52-30 lead there. So that would be a 22-point lead. That's safe. Mike Rounds versus Brian Bangs from back in November. Only a 13-point lead for Rounds over Bangs. So that's very significant as well. Let's see who the Democrat. Julian Boudin's the only one that's declared. Brian Bangs is now running as an independent. So they're both in the race. This is tough because I could definitely go with the independent one of Rounds versus Bangs, but if Boudin and Bangs are both in the race, how does that go? I'd imagine they'd probably split some votes away from each other. So going with the Boudin poll would be safe Republican. This poll would be likely Republican. I'm going to make the executive decision on this one to make it as safe Republican, but you could certainly disagree and argue in the comment section about that. I have no problem with that because that's kind of a dicey one. South Dakota, though, overall is a pretty safe red state, 31.5 in 2020, 43.5 in 2022. Nebraska, we're going to skip as well because this is Dan Osborne versus Pete Ricketts. I want to talk more about that one. Kansas, we can look at Kansas now. Kansas is a state that actually is trending to be a little bit more competitive in the last 15 years or so. That kind of might be surprising. But for the general election for the Senate, 3 out of the 4 have it a solid Republican race. The White House does have it as lean, but the consensus on this one is safe for the Republicans. So I'll put Kansas as safe for the GOP. And just to show you what Kansas means on the Senate level, it is, I want to say it's down here, right here. Here it is, 11.4% in 2020. So decently competitive. 23% in 2022, averages out to 17.2. So it is a safe Republican margin, but in the right election environment like 2020, could potentially be competitive. Looking at the state of Oklahoma, this is, I believe, Mark Wayne Mullen's seat, which is now open due to the fact that he is serving in the Trump administration. No polling, but there is a safe Republican ranking there. No surprising. Oklahoma is one of the most red states in all of the United States, and I believe it's down here at averaging 29.775. So, yeah, not really too much of a shock on that one. Texas, another state that's going to be competitive. I want to bypass for now. We'll go to Louisiana. Louisiana is an interesting state because it has a very fascinating Republican primary underway with Bill Cassidy, and he's getting a primary challenge from the Republican John Fleming and Representative Julia Letlau, who has been endorsed by Donald Trump. For the general election, though, there's been no polls. It is listed as a solid Republican state, so we'll put it in solid for the GOP. Louisiana, 42 points for the Republicans on average over the last few elections. Not really any surprise there. So that's Louisiana. We'll look at Arkansas now. Arkansas, I do believe this is the Senate seat held by Tom Cotton. Yes, it is. He's running. He's going into the general election. And there has been one poll from Gray House, a Republican polling firm. So take this with a grain of salt, but it is a 22-point lead for Tom Cotton. probably not too far off, even though it is a Republican poll. That one goes safe for the Republicans. In Arkansas, one of the most red states in the country, averaging out about 33.85. Iowa, we're also going to bypass due to the fact that it's going to be pretty competitive. Minnesota, you could make a similar argument for bypassing it as well, though the likelihood of it being competitive in 2026 is probably not too great, given the fact that this is going to be a very good year for the Democrats in all likelihood. Now, the general election looks like either Angie Craig or Peggy Flanagan. Peggy Flanagan seems to be leading thus far. On the Republican side, Republican Michelle Tafoya is the leading Republican, I'd say, right now. For the general, actually pretty competitive when you look at the most recent poll. For Angie Craig versus Michelle Tafoya is a 7-point lead. For Peggy Flanagan versus Michelle Tafoya, it's about a 6-point lead, both of which are likely Democratic. So I'm going to put this race in the likely Democratic column instead of just picking a Democrat right now. I think Flanagan's more likely to win than Angie Craig in the Democratic primary, but we'll just leave it at likely Democrat for now and not have to pick for that one. We'll go to the state of Illinois. Illinois, this one should not be too hard to choose at all. We do know pretty much certainty this is going to be a safe Democratic win. I'll pull up the Minnesota average results in just one moment as well. Solid Democrat out of Illinois, just to speed this one up a little bit. So for Illinois, without a doubt, very safe state in the United States, 16.1% in 2020, 15.3% in 2022, an average of 15.7%, a safe Democratic state. Now, Minnesota is a very interesting state. When Amy Klobuchar is on the ballot for Senate, it's been safe both times, 24.1% in 2018, 15.7% in 2024. Now, for the Tina Smith special elections, she won by 10.6% in 2018 and only 5.2% in 2020. Now, in 2020, there was a lot of vote splitting involved in that race. So ultimately what this all means is it averages out to about 13.9%, which would fall into the likely Democratic category. How we see this go in 2026 is going to be interesting because this is supposed to be a good night for the Democrats and a very strong night. There also may be less vote splitting from a third party this time around. So Minnesota is going to be a very fascinating state to watch for as well. We're going to look at the state of Mississippi. Mississippi should be a pretty solidly red state if there's even a poll that is out there. I don't believe there is last time. Oh, there is actually a poll, it seems. Oh, it's a hypothetical poll. Okay. Cindy Hyde-Smith versus generic Democrat from June 18th to 22nd of 2025. It's not a specific candidate. I mean, I definitely could just go with that one and give it to the Democrats, but the predictions are all solid Republicans, so I'll overrule it on that one just for the sake of, we know Mississippi's not going to be going blue, and if it does, it's not going to be going blue by 9 points or whatever. But Mississippi, very red state, but there's a little bit of underperformance from the Republicans there when it's Cindy Hyde-Smith. So in 2018, the Republican wins by 19 points. Cindy Hyde-Smith only wins in that same election by 7.3. Then in 2020, she only wins by 10 points. In 2024, the state goes red, 25.6. On average, just barely over 15 points at 15.475. I remember my live stream I was making, a commenter made a point that we might see Cindy Hyde-Smith fall under that 15% and be a likely Republican win, and it's certainly possible for 2026 as she seems to be underperforming a lot of the other Republicans in the state of Mississippi. So that's a very interesting one to keep an eye out for as well. We can look at the state of Tennessee. Tennessee, I do believe this is Republican. Is it Bill Hagerty or is it... I do believe it is Bill Hagerty in the state of Tennessee. Yes, it is. As for the general election, there's not been any polling done on this one either, but this is solid Republican across all the rankings and will be so as well. We're going to do Tennessee, Kentucky, West Virginia all in one here because there's not really too much of a difference in terms of the results would be my best guess. We'll look at Kentucky. We do know Mitch McConnell is retiring. As for the general election, though, I mean, public policy polling, Andy Barr versus Charles Booker, Republican plus 11. We have Cameron versus Charles Booker, Republican plus about 7. And Nate Morris is only Republican plus 1. Now, for the Republican primary, how this is currently shaping up, it's close. It's really close, looks like right now, between Daniel Cameron and Andy Barr. So either way, both Cameron and Barr were leading their Democratic opponents by a likely Republican margin. So we're going to put Kentucky in likely Republican for right now. And on West Virginia, we'll just do West Virginia very quickly because there's not going to be, I don't believe there's going to be too much competitiveness there. Let's go back to, yes, here it is. We'll go down to West Virginia, and we'll see this is Shelley Moore Capito. I do believe she is running for a third term. General election, no predictions, or no polls, just predictions at this current point in time. Not too much of a surprise. West Virginia is staying red. For the average results, Tennessee, 10.8%, the Phil Bredesen, Marsha Blackburn race. Since then, it's been very red, 27 Republican in 2020, and 29.6 in 2024. Overall, a safe red state at 22.46. Kentucky, McConnell, 2020, 19.5% win. In 2022, 23.6% for Rand Paul. Kentucky overall safe state. So seeing it be in the likely Republican column is a little strange, but overall wouldn't be too shocked. But it's going to be a red state when everything is all said and done. West Virginia, despite the fact that Joe Manchin won the state in 2018 by 3.2%, since then it's been one of the most red states in the country, going 43.3 for Capito in 2020. And then when Manchin did not run, in 2024, Jim Justice won it by 41 points, an average of 29.16 across that. So, without a doubt, West Virginia is a very safe, reliably red state. While we're down here in the, I could get into Virginia now and North Carolina. I'm going to do it a little differently. I'm going to go Delaware, New Jersey, go into New England, and then stop at New Hampshire and Maine, and then circle back to Virginia in North Carolina. We're going to do it this way. I'm going to get a little funky with how we're doing the order this time. So we're going to go to the state of Delaware. This is going to be Democratic Senator Chris Coons. And I don't believe there's any polling done, but there is a prediction market of solid Democratic. Not really any surprise there. Delaware going to go safe for the Democrats. Now we have New Jersey with Cory Booker. After the governor's election, which really ended up being a very big Democratic win, really not too much of a doubt this race is not going to be too competitive. No polling yet. Solid Democratic, though, across the board. Fort Booker going to win the state of New Jersey by a safe margin. Just really quickly, we can look at Delaware. Safe Democratic, all three elections, 2018, 2020, 2024. 20.26% average across them. We can look at New Jersey, which 2 out of the last 3 have actually fallen under 15 points, 11.2% in 2018, 9.6% in 2024. However, Booker won in 2020 by 16.3, so he was a safe Democratic win. We'll have to wait and see how that goes for that race, but I'd imagine it'll end up being safe Democratic. Should be worth noting this was Bob Menendez in 2018, who was scandal-plagued. That certainly could have played a role as well in that race being under 15 points. Next, we're going to go to the state of Rhode Island, a state that's not usually talked about too much at the Senate level and the national level. It is no polling, but it is solid Democratic. Not really any surprise here. Rhode Island goes solid for the Democrats. And before going to the chart, we're going to look just really quickly at Massachusetts because this one's not going to be too competitive either. This is Ed Markey running for another term in the U.S. Senate. He is facing a primary challenge from Seth Moulton, the U.S. representative. I think Markey starts out as the favorite, but we'll have to wait and see how that all goes. Now, there actually has been some polling for Ed Markey versus John Deaton, which is the likely matchup right now from the University of New Hampshire from back in February, and Markey's beating Deaton by roughly about 30 points or so. So that's obviously outside the 15-point margin. Without a doubt, Massachusetts ends up going in the safe Democratic category. Now, that is kind of interesting, though, is Massachusetts did get narrower in 2024. Elizabeth Warren winning by only quote-unquote 19.8%. Still a safe Democratic win, but it did get a lot smaller than the 2020 margin of a 33.1% win. Now for 2026, the midterm year, going to be expecting a very safe Democratic win for Ed Markey or Seth Moulton, but probably Ed Markey without much of a doubt, 25.7%. Rhode Island's also been safe Democratic the last 3, 23, 33, and 20, 25.4% average. No really surprise there. Now we're going to go to some of the states getting a little more competitive, but first we have the state of Virginia. Virginia is a state that used to be a very competitive state in the early 2000s and into the early 2010s. At the Senate level, though, not expecting too much of a competitive race. This is Democratic incumbent Mark Warner. On the Republican side, there are 4 Republicans running, none of which are super notable, well-known names. Like, you're not Glenn Youngkin or Jason Mayares or anything. For the general election, safe Democratic rankings. The only hypothetical polls from Mark Warner versus Glenn Youngkin, but he's not running. So taking that out, going with the rankings, Virginia starts in the safe Democratic category. Again, not really too much of a surprise there. We'll go to South Carolina with Lindsey Graham. This is a state that definitely could fall under 15 points. I haven't looked at this one yet, so it'll be interesting to see if there's any polls, but there's always going to be an interesting conversation about Lindsey Graham. In the most recent poll for Annie Andrews versus Lindsey Graham is only a 5-point lead for Graham versus Andrews. So 5 to 15 is in the likely category, but literally not by much for Graham versus Andrews. So South Carolina starts out in the likely Republican category, and that one honestly does make a little bit of sense when you look at the numbers here. 10.3% for Graham in 2020. Now, Tim Scott did win by 25.9%, so it brings the number up over 18.1. So it certainly does skew that average by a lot, but Lindsey Graham only winning by 10.3, certainly could see him winning by under 15. Virginia in 2018 went for 16 points for Tim Kaine, 12.1 for Mark Warner in 2020, only 8.9 for Tim Kaine in 2024. So it's been likely Democratic in all the last two elections in Virginia, 12.33% average. So it should be likely Democratic on the average side, but given the election environment, I think safe Democratic is certainly possible for election night. Next, we're going to go to the state of Florida. Florida, this is going to be the Ashley Moody Senate race. This one is a special election as well, worth noting. For the general election, the most recent poll, we have Ashley Moody versus Angie Nixon is roughly about an 8-point lead, and Ashley Moody versus Alexander Vindman is roughly about a 7-point lead. How the Democratic Party or primary shakes out, we'll have to wait and see, but the result's the same on this side of things. Florida starts out in the likely Republican category. Okay, so we've gone through all of those states, which consensus rankings, you can make arguments here and there, but most of those states aren't considered to be the main prizes of 2026 that are in danger of flipping for their respective parties. The remaining 10 toss-up Senate seats that I have on the map here, the ones in gray, these are the ones that are considered by most political analysts to be the ones that are up for grabs, some more than others, but these are the ones to really watch for 2026. And we're going to start with a very fascinating one in the state of Nebraska. Now, Nebraska is an interesting one because this isn't actually a Republican versus a Democrat. This is the independent candidate, Dan Osborne, who just ran for Senate in 2024 and lost by a lot smaller margin than expected in 2024. He'll be facing off against the Republican Senator Pete Ricketts. Now, early on, these predictions have it as solid Republican for Inside and Cook. For Sabino's crystal ball, it's likely. Race White House, it's lean. So 2 out of the 4 have it as solid, but 2 out of the 4 also have it at likely or below. Now, for the predictions, we just went through that. For the polling, the most recent poll from Impact Research has it at 48 to 47 with 5% undecided. Now, this is a Democratic pollster, and it is sponsored by Osborne's campaign, so you certainly have to take that with a grain of salt. But for the purpose of today's video, the most recent poll only shows Ricketts leading by a 1-point lead. So we're going to actually utilize the tilt feature for once and make Nebraska tilt Republican, since he's only leading Pete Ricketts by 1 point. So that's a very interesting poll out of the state of Nebraska, showing a very close race. I also just remembered I forgot to show Florida on the chart as well. 2018, Bill Nelson only lost to Rick Scott by 0.12%. That heavily skews the results here. 2022, Rubio won by 16.4%. 2024 went 12.8%. In 2024 for Rick Scott, an average of 9.73, so right around with the likely margin. Now, Nebraska is an interesting state because look at it. Safe Republican in 2018, safe Republican in 2020, safe Republican in the special election in 2024 with Pete Ricketts. Only the Dan Osborne race versus Deb Fisher, I believe it is, was 6.7%. So the average is a safe Republican at 22.35, but the only Dan Osborne race that he was involved in, under 10 points, under 15 points, likely Republican. Now, in this most recent poll, it's only tilt Republican, showing Nebraska is truly going to be a very competitive state in 2026. Now we're going to look at the state of Texas. Texas is a very fascinating one. A lot of people are talking about this one. And the primary, did the election night, the live stream. How could you not? James Talarico, the Democratic candidate, certainly getting a lot of media attention and he is going to be facing off against one of Ken Paxton or John Cornyn. Right now, in the runoff election, it's very close. Looks like Ken Paxton has pulled ahead, barring an endorsement from President Trump. Paxton has led in every single poll except for one where he was tied. So probably going to be, in my prediction for this race, we're going to see Tallarico versus Paxton. And the most recent poll from Impact Research shows Tallarico leading Cornyn by 2. And James Tallarico versus Ken Paxton, he's up by 1. The public policy poll before that, another Democratic poll, Tallarico's up by 2. University of Houston YouGov poll before that, Paxton's up by 2. So even though it is a Democratic poll, and it may be skewing the numbers a little bit, I still think Paxton versus Tallarico is the way it goes right now. The polling seems to suggest that as well, which means we can again utilize the tilt feature. This time, based on the most recent poll that's come out, Texas is actually tilt Democratic, which it's a very close race between Tallarico and Paxton especially. It's not impossible Texas can go blue on election night, but seeing Texas go blue on a map is certainly something that we have not seen in a very large time, or a very long time. It'll be very interesting to see on election night if that ends up happening. As for the chart for Texas, Ted Cruz only won by 2.6% in 2018. It only went red for Cornyn in 2020 by 9.6%, and Cruz won by 8.5% in 2024. Only an average of 6.9%. If the Democrats win, or if the Democrats have a very strong night where everything is going their way, like a 2006 type midterm election where everything just breaks for them, Texas is absolutely in play of potentially flipping for James Tallarico against the Republicans. So can't wait to watch that one and see how that unfolds. Next, we have the state of Alaska. Like with Mary Peltola in Alaska, similar to James Tallarico, she is a very strong candidate for the state, and in this election environment is making it a lot more competitive than maybe it otherwise would be in past years. That being said, Peltola is a very great Democratic candidate facing off against the Republican Dan Sullivan, and this one has been very, very close. Now, a polling average from race to the White House as well. The predictions in this one still are leaning Republican across the top 3 prediction websites, and the most recent poll, however, Alaska Survey Research, it has the overall numbers from the first round, then advances to the next round, and then once the ranked choice voting is done, Peltola leads Sullivan by 4 points, 52 to 48. And with a lot of Democratic polls and non-Democratic polls throughout, Peltola is starting to stack up a little bit of a lead in most of these polls, a consistent one of a few points here and there. So at 52 to 48, that falls under the 5-point lead margin. We're going to put Alaska in lean Democratic based on the most recent polls. It's a little hard to see, but this is lean, this is tilt, by the way, for the Democrats as well. So Alaska, a state that's usually likely Republican, could be potentially flipping Democrat based on the most recent poll. It was likely Republican in 2020, likely Republican in 2022, an average of 10.5%. Now the Democrats in the most recent poll leading in that state. Next, we're going to go to the state of Iowa. Iowa is a state that's also a very usually likely red state. This is Joni Ernst's seat. She is retiring. So for the Republican primary right now, Ashley Hinson, the U.S. representative, is going to win that. Democrat Josh Turek and Zach Walz are fighting it out on the Democratic side. Right now, I don't know if there has been some polling done where Zach Walz has been leading, but this is still a certainly competitive primary to wait and see how it all goes with a lot of undecideds, But for this race, so far, pretty competitive. The only polls we have for both Hinson, Turek, Hinson, Walz are 44-41, 3-point lead in both of them. So with that, we put Iowa into the lean Republican category. Iowa is a state on the chart that the average of last results, 6.5 in 2020, 12.2 in 2022, an average of a likely Republican 9.35%. Iowa looks to be very competitive in 2026 and maybe reverting back to the early Donald Trump days where it was still a very competitive state. So now Republicans are at 48, Democrats are at 46. We are next going to go to the state of Michigan. Michigan's a very close state, very important state to watch for. This has been one of the main battleground states of 2026 since really the beginning of the election process in Michigan. Now, Michigan, what's interesting is the Republican primary, we know really who's going to be the nominee. It's going to be Mike Rogers, the nominee from 2024. The Democrats, wide open. Abdul Al-Sayed, Mallory McMorrow, and Haley Stevens are all fighting it out for the Democratic side, and the polling is extremely tight. look at this, like 1-2 points separating McMorrow from Stevens and Abdul Al-Sayed. Who wins his primary? Really anybody's guess at this point. Race to the White House is McMorrow up 2.1, Real Clear Politics 0.4, super close. The predictions are all toss-up except for Race to the White House, which is still Democrat. For Haley Stevens, the most recent polling average, the most recent poll from Emerson College, has her up 5 over Mike Rogers. For Abdul Al-Sayed, it's a tied race between Abdul Al-Sayed and Mike Rogers. And then for McMorrow versus Mike Rogers, it's 46-43. So you have 2 lean Democrats and 1 tie. So with that said, we're going to put it, well, actually technically likely Democrat for Haley Stevens, but it's super tight. The polling shows McMorrow is slightly leading right now. The most recent poll for that one, she's leading. So I'm going to go with McMorrow as the Democratic candidate versus Mike Rogers. And since she's leading by lean Democrat in the most recent poll, I'll make Michigan lean Democratic. Now, this one's going to be interesting as well, as Michigan, considered one of the marquee matchups for 26, a 6.5% win in 2018, only a 1.7% win in 2020 with Trump at the top of the ticket. In 2024, look at this, only 0.34% win in 2024, an average of 2.846%, all which won by the Democrat. So a lean Democratic win is certainly 100% in line with the average results from the last few Senate races in Michigan, but man, that one is very close. Next, we have the state of Ohio. Ohio, this is going to be a very fascinating race for the fact that even though Ohio is trending red in a lot of directions, it does seem this is going to be a competitive race with U.S. Senator John Husted facing off against former Democratic U.S. Senator Sherrod Brown. Now, the polling for this one, the predictions, lean Republican, lean Republican, lean Republican. Race to the White House has it till Democrat. For Sherrod Brown versus John Husted, though, the polling shows a different story. 270 to win, the polling average has Brown ahead of Husted. Race to the White House also has him ahead. Real Clear Politics has Husted ahead. Now, the most recent poll from Qantas Insights, which is a Republican pollster, take that with a grain of salt, has Husted leading by 2 points over Sherrod Brown. 2 polls before that, though, showed Sherrod Brown leading. Emerson College's poll from December had Husted up 3. Certainly, right now, the most recent poll, Husted over Brown is Republican +2. Even though it is a Republican poll, we haven't done differently so far in this video, it would be a lean Republican. But certainly, this Ohio Senate race between Husted and Brown is shaping up to be a back and forth under 5-point win for either Republican or Democrat in a very tight competitive Senate race. As for the numbers on Ohio, it went for Sherrod Brown by 6.8% in 2018, J.D. Vance 6.1% in 2022, and then Bernie Moreno defeated Sherrod Brown by 3.6%, an average of 5.5%. So even though it's an average of likely Republican or likely just overall 5.5, all the last 3 Senate races in Ohio have been very competitive, and this one is shaping up to be, once again, it seems, or it appears to be at this current point in time. Next, we're going to go to North Carolina. North Carolina, this is certainly one a lot of people are watching because this is the Democrats having a chance to win the state. They have not won on the Senate level since, I believe, 2008. And the reason being, the Democratic former governor, Roy Cooper, is the Democratic nominee facing off against Republican Michael Whatley, who is the nominee after U.S. Senator Thom Tillis did not run for re-election. The general election is tossed up from 3 out of the 4 rankings, except for Race to the White House, who has it as likely Democratic, and that's for good reason. When you look at the most recent polling and polling averages, Roy Cooper is led in every single poll, including the most recent Republican Harper polling poll, which is sponsored by the Carolina Journal, showing Cooper up 49-41, an 8-point likely Democratic lead. So right now, Roy Cooper is leading Michael Whatley by 8 points, a likely Democratic margin in the state of North Carolina, which just voted for Donald Trump in 2024. As for the Senate level, North Carolina has been incredibly close. A 1.7% win for the Republican in 2020, Thom Tillis. Ted Budd won it in 2022 by 3.2%, an average of 2.45%. So a likely win and even a likely Democratic win is certainly outside of the norm of the last few election results in North Carolina, and Roy Cooper thus far, obviously early on, still a lot of undecided voters, but Roy Cooper seems to be running away with this race so far, and he has it in likely Democratic on the most recent poll. Next, we're going to go to the state of Georgia. This is U.S. Senator Jon Ossoff. This was viewed as one of the Republicans' best pickup opportunities starting out early on. Now things are looking a little bit more murkier for them. With Jon Ossoff being the Democratic candidate, the Republican primary is certainly still very divided between Mike Collins, Buddy Carter, and Derek Dooley. The polling on this one shows a tight race. The most recent poll has Mike Collins as the Republican leader at this current point in time, so we're going to go with him as the candidate. The general election predictions, 2 out of the 4 have a toss-up. 2 out of the 4 have it lean Democratic. We're going to go Buddy Carter versus Jon Ossoff. The most recent poll from Emerson is Democrat +3. For Mike Collins, Emerson versus Collins is Democrat Jon Ossoff +5. For Dooley, Emerson has the Democrat +8. With Mike Collins seeming to be the most likely Democrat at this current point in time, we're going to go Ossoff 48, Collins 43. That's a 5-point lead. Georgia goes also into the likely Democratic category. Now for Georgia, it was a 1.2% win in 2020 for Jon Ossoff, a 2.1% win for Raphael Warnock, and then in 2022, Warnock won re-election by 2.8%, an average of roughly 2.03% margin of victory for the last 3 Senate elections. Based on how the polling has gone thus far, in the most recent poll, Jon Ossoff is looking like he's going to expand on that margin. So with just 2 states left, New Hampshire and Maine, Democrats are at 49, Republicans are at 49, based on the polls, the most recent poll in every single state. Can the Republicans hold their majority, or can the Democrats win Senate control? We're going to find out with these last 2 states, starting with the state of New Hampshire. Where New Hampshire is a state that actually might be catching Democrats by a little bit of surprise, with U.S. Senator Jeanne Shaheen retiring in a midterm that's supposed to be a very good night for the Democrats. It may be shocking for the Democrats to know that this race is actually pretty competitive. Chris Pappas, the U.S. representative, is likely going to be the Democratic nominee. On the Republican side, 2 former U.S. senators are running. John E. Sununu, the brother of former Governor Chris Sununu, and a former U.S. senator, is running, and former Massachusetts Senator Scott Brown, who also ran for Senate in New Hampshire in 2014. Now, the primary polling on this one for Scott Brown versus John Sununu really isn't too close at this current point in time. Sununu is already at 48%. Scott Brown's at 19%, so Sununu has an over 15-point lead at this current point in time in the Republican primary. So we go to the general election for Pappas versus Sununu, where the rankings right now are tilt Democrat from inside elections, and then the rest of them are all lean Democratic. Now, for Pappas versus Brown, the Emerson College poll, which just came out a few days ago, last week, Pappas is up over Brown roughly about 9 points, so that'd be a likely Democratic lead. Pappas versus Sununu, though, different story. Roughly 45-44, Chris Pappas over John E. Sununu, only a 1-point lead in the most recent poll out of the New Hampshire Senate race. So Sununu, being the Sununu name in New Hampshire, running as a Republican, the Sununus being known as more of a moderate establishment type of Republican than a Trump MAGA Republican, seems to be making this race a lot more competitive than a lot of political analysts would usually expect. So the most recent poll in New Hampshire, the Democrat Chris Pappas does hold on and win, but he only does so by a 1-point tilt Democratic margin. So New Hampshire could be very interesting to watch for as well. We can look to the chart for what New Hampshire's been, and it's kind of interesting because Jeanne Shaheen won by 15.6% in 2020, and Maggie Hassan won by 9.1% in 2022, an average result of 12.35%. The only difference here is John Sununu is a far more qualified, much better Republican candidate than the 2 nominees of 2020 and 2022, and that's apparent thus far in the early polling data. Still, though, with the most recent poll, Chris Pappas is up by 1 point and gives the seat for the Democrats, which means Democrats are at 50, Republicans are at 49. It all comes down to Maine. If the Republicans win, it ties the Senate at 50-50, with Vance breaking the tie, Vice President Vance. If Democrats win the state of Maine in the most recent poll, the Democrats flip the Senate 51-49. So it all comes down to Maine. It all comes down to the Senate race, which is currently held by Republican U.S. Senator Susan Collins, who won despite trailing in the polls in 2020. She did end up winning and pulling out this victory. On the Democratic primary, a lot of talk has been made about Graham Plattner versus Janet Mills in this Democratic primary. And for a while, it looked like it could be close. Now things are starting to slowly pull ahead, it seems. Emerson College's most recent poll, Graham Plattner's at 55%. Janet Mills, the governor of the state, is only at 28%. So it looks like Graham Plattner is on his way to being the Democratic nominee for Senate. As for the general election, it's listed tilt Republican for inside elections, toss-up between Cook Politico, Sabato, and race to the White House. Now, the polling averages between Janet Mills and Susan Collins are very close. The most recent Emerson College poll shows Janet Mills up 46 to 43 over Susan Collins, a lean Democratic lead. But with Graham Plattner looking like to be the Democratic candidate, what happens for Plattner versus Collins is where things ultimately goes. And that most recent poll from Emerson College shows Plattner leading Collins by an even larger lead, 48 to 41, a 7-point lead in the state of Maine in this race, a likely lead for the Democrat, which means putting Maine in the likely Democratic category. This officially means, based on the poll, the most recent poll in every single state for the United States Senate, Democrats would have 51 Senate seats, Republicans would have 49. The Democrats would flip the Senate back from the Republicans to the Democrats for Senate control, including winning some longtime Republican stalwart seats like in Alaska, like in Texas, like nearly winning Nebraska, and flipping longtime Republican incumbent Susan Collins in Maine and winning toss-up states like North Carolina. So a very big night for the Democrats based on the latest poll in every single state, showing the Democrats at 51 to 49. Lastly, before we end the video, we're just going to look at Maine, because obviously we've gone through the chart for the rest of them. Maine's an interesting state. It's been safe for Angus King in 2018 and 2024 over 15 points. Now, Susan Collins only won by 8.6%, a likely Republican margin. It brings the average down to 15.03. So Maine's a very special state, a very interesting state in how it does its elections, because it's at the same time electing an independent senator twice now that votes Democratic regularly, like all the time, and Susan Collins, who is a Republican senator who, despite being described as a moderate, does vote with President Trump a very large percentage of the time, well over 50% of the time, won re-election by a large amount in 2020. However, as the polling shows, the most recent poll shows that may be running out in 2026. We'll have to wait and see. But I hope you enjoyed this video. Democrats 51, Republicans 49, based on the newest poll in every state. I hope you enjoyed it. Make sure to like and subscribe if you did. Stay tuned. I have very important videos and exciting videos coming out and have come out in the last few days, including my bracket challenge for the 2028 presidential primary. Make sure to go check that out as well if you're interested at the end of this video. Thank you so much for watching. I hope to see you in the next video.